Hello, good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I'm Cynthia Pinto Cabrera, the Policy Assistant for the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. I'm going to be running the tech support for all of you, and if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to send me a message, and in a brief moment I will post a phone number that you can either call or text for tech support. Buenos días a todos, soy Cintia Pinto Cabrera, la asistente de póliza para la coalición de la calidad de aire del Valle Central, y voy a hacer su apoyo técnico esta mañana. Si tiene algunas preguntas o tiene más unas preguntas, me puede mandar un mensaje por el chat, o puede, en un breve momento voy a poner un número de teléfono que puede mandar mensaje de texto o puede llamar para apoyo técnico. Let's see. So depending on what device you're on, we're gonna switch over to interpretation. So if you're on a computer, you are going to see a little world icon that you can go ahead and select interpretation language. If you are an English speaker, you will need to select the English channel. And for cell phones and tablets, you'll have an icon with about 3 dots. Go ahead and select that, select language interpretation, and you can select your language. So dependiendo en qué está usando, puede ser computadora, tableta o su celular, ahorita puede seleccionar la interpretación. Si está en su computadora, va a haber un icono con un mundo y lo puede seleccionar el idioma que prefiere. Si habla inglés, por favor, seleccione la opción de inglés. Si está en celular o tableta, hay un icono que tiene 3 puntos. Por favor, seleccione ese y escoja su lenguaje de ahí. So for this webinar, we will be using the question and answer feature to ask the panelists questions that will be answered after all of the presentations. So for both computers, cell phones, and tablets, there's going to be an icon that has the Q&A. Please select that and type in any questions or comments that you have. So para esta junta vamos a usar el icono de Q y A para poder presentar preguntas o comentarios que tienen a los que están presentando hoy esta mañana. Estas preguntas van a estar contestadas después que todos presenten. Se puede seleccionar el icono que tiene el Q y el A en su computadora o su celular o tableta que está usando para usar preguntas. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and pass it over to our facilitator, Katie Valenzuela. Y se lo voy a pasar ahora a nuestra facilitadora, Katie Valenzuela.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Katie Valenzuela. I use she, her pronouns. I was born and raised in Oildale, and I now live and work in Sacramento, helping environmental justice groups like VISIÓN and CVAQ fight for legislation. At the heart of the environmental justice movement is a fight for economic justice. No one should be forced to choose between a good job and having clean air and clean water and healthy families. So today's webinar, you're going to hear about the impacts that the oil and gas industry is having on health, quality of life, and the economy in the San Joaquin Valley. While this is not about legislation, this group is a sponsor of SB 467, and we are continuing to seek that holistic, transformative legislation that will provide a meaningful pathway for healthy communities and for good jobs in regions like the San Joaquin Valley. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Catherine Grupa-White, the Executive Director of the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition.
Thanks so much, Katie, and greetings, everyone. I'm Catherine, the Director of CVAQ and VISIÓN Steering Committee member. I live and work in unceded Yokuts and Miwok lands, and the genocidal and racist legacies of this country have to be confronted in order to seek holistic solutions to our air pollution challenges. The San Joaquin Valley is the most polluted air basin for particulate matter 2.5 microns or smaller, also known as PM 2.5, and one of the most polluted for ozone. These harmful pollutants cost our health and economy billions each year, literally damaging our hearts, minds, lungs, and immune systems, increasing vulnerability to viruses like COVID-19, and impacting populations like our children even more severely. The oil industry contributes significantly to dirty air, particularly for people of color who disproportionately live nearby. Just 4 corporations, Chevron, Era Energy, Berry Petroleum, and Plains Exploration, account for half of all PM2.5 emissions from large stationary sources in our air basin. That's more direct PM2.5 than is produced by all passenger vehicles and light and medium duty trucks combined. Additional harm is caused to people living nearby. Extraction produces toxic air contaminants, including volatile organic compounds like benzene and formaldehyde and particulate matter. Oil and gas activities are responsible for 30 to 60% of all toxic air contaminant emissions in the valley, particularly VOCs. Citizen scientists and community advocates have exposed many contradictions to California's claims of having the strongest regulations and safest practices in the oil industry in the United States. Rules are only good if properly enforced and not riddled with loopholes and exceptions that allow companies to buy their way out of the problem, from exemptions from air regulations for quote unquote small producers to a broken credit pollution banking system, which the oil industry is a major credit holder and user of, and the volatile organic compounds bank alone is now at a deficit of 2,000 tons of pollution that is unaccounted for. Kern County's environmental impact report that treats future wells as one project and establishes a mitigation fund that polluters can pay into rather than controlling pollution on site has the potential to add 780,000 tons of air pollution to Kern County through 2035. This expansion will cause a significant cumulative increase in air pollution. Our fossil-based economy is fundamentally unsustainable, and our communities can and must have a healthy environment and life-affirming jobs that pay a living wage. While there are no silver bullets for how to do it, the transition is already underway. Frontline communities must be front and center in shaping a just transition. I'm honored and so grateful to share space with today's panelists, who will each shed further light on challenges and opportunities presented by a just transition for the Valley's economy and oil workers. Before the panelists share, 2 of our guests who are in the virtual room with us today and are not panelists will briefly introduce themselves. Dan and Kobe.
Hi, my name is Dan Ress. I am a staff attorney for the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, and I focus on statewide oil and gas policy. My pronouns are they and them, and I live in Yokuts land in Delano.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kobe Nasik. I'm the Coalition Coordinator of VISIÓN, or VISIÓN, Voices in Solidarity Against Oil in Neighborhoods, which is a coalition of around 10 environmental justice, health and safety, frontline organizations in California working on the singular goal of getting oil and gas out of our neighborhoods, calling in from unceded Ohlone land in North Oakland. And I'm really glad to be here with all of you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan and Kobe. So now a special thanks to the Central California Environmental Justice Network for assisting with outreach and technical support. I'd like to pass it to our first panelist, Francisco Gonzalez of Arvin, to share his experience living at the site of a major pipeline leak. Francisco, go ahead.
Buenos días. Mi nombre es Francisco González.
Good morning. My name is Francisco Gonzalez, and I am a resident from Arvin. Here, the contamination is terrible. We have such a strong contamination that we can't even use the water. And here, we had a leak with gas and oil, and we had a lot of problems that we were even at a point where we were going to explode. And we've had a lot of help from Gustavo and Cesar so that they can change some of the things that are going on around here. we have been fortunate that they haven't taken us out of our homes. But my neighbors that were in front of that problem, they took them out for 9 months. They put them in some hotels while they would clean all the contamination. And well, the things here are very difficult. And I hope that you guys can do something to help us. My wife, she suffers from allergies, and she doesn't even know why, but she can't even be outside in her garden because she can't breathe. And it smells a lot like oil here. I don't know if maybe there's still some leaks going on around here, because the people who live around here, they wake up in the morning and when they go outside, they say, wow, it smells a lot like oil. And us, we're already used to it because we don't even know if it smells or it doesn't smell anymore. So we have a lot of worry. And well, I'm older in age. I'm not very worried about myself anymore, but I have some grandkids that I am worried about. And if you could help, it would be a very big help, and we would be very thankful with all of our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco, for joining us today to share your story. It's much appreciated. Now I'd like to pass to talk about the Kern County workforce and economy, the impacts and opportunities, Ingrid Brostrom from the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment.
Thank you. And I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I just popped up. All right. All right, thank you, Katie. So I'm going to share a little bit about the environmental justice perspective on transitioning Kern County's workforce, environment, and economy. The Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, we are based in Kern County in Delano and do a lot of our work down there. And we have certainly seen firsthand the impacts, the great impacts that the oil and gas industry has had on many communities. And I thank Francisco for sharing the story of Nelson Court, which is well known locally in Kern County, but may not be known to the wider public in California, and has been a very large emergency with a leak literally driving people out of their homes for 8 months. So the magnitude of impacts is immense in Kern County, and is part of the daily life. So just to begin, and when we talk about this tension between oil, the fossil fuel industry, and jobs and the environment, when we step back, we really do all have very similar goals. And economic justice is very much part of environmental justice. And economic is critical to having good, healthy, sustainable lives. So we all want to see thriving and a prosperous local economy in Kern County. We all want to see a sufficient tax base that'll pay for the necessary local and social services. We all want to see good and well-paying and safe jobs in the Kern region, as well as healthy places to live, work, and play. And we really want to see increased investment in Kern County specifically, and also prioritizing other areas that have been historically harmed by environmental hazards. The state has benefited on the backs of residents in Kern County, and there is a great debt owed to the region. So just to take a step back and look at what's happening naturally in California, and definitely in Kern, which where most of oil extraction happens in California. We have seen a precipitous decline and a steady decline since the 1980s. California is producing a ever increasingly smaller share of the United States oil. And this trend is going to continue. Our crude in California is some of the lowest quality, only matched by the tar sands in terms of its heavy weight and the difficulty in removal and the climate, its climate impacts. So California's crude is going to only become more and more difficult to extract. And this is without the immense policy changes and the direction that we see our country going in our state. So here we have this graph where we see the decline in oil and gas. And then, conversely, you see that California has more and more idle wells. So these are wells that no longer make economic sense to produce, and yet they're not being capped, they're not being officially shut down, and they're continuing to remain in our communities uncapped and also creating an additional pollution burden. So these are the things that are happening in the background. So to move to the workforce. So what's happening with the workforce? So first off, I want to just note that, if you listen to some folks in the oil and gas industry, you will hear extremely high numbers of workforce. And I think the first thing I want to just point out is credibility matters. If you're hearing numbers, hundreds of thousands of jobs at stake here, ask for the source. Ask for the source of information. These numbers I'm pulling here, these are from WSPA, the Western States Petroleum Association, which put out these numbers in 2019. And these numbers are even higher than is put out by the state. So, but this gives you a sense of the real numbers we're talking about. Now, they're not insignificant, but they're not insurmountable. You will see that even in the best case scenarios, and these are figures from 2019, so this is not accounting for the recent events of 2020, 2021. So obviously these numbers are much larger in terms of the job losses. But even in the best case scenario, these numbers are falling and they will continue to fall. And so, so we're dealing at a magnitude of, 10,000, between 10,000 and 20,000 jobs statewide. So these are the real figures. The other thing I will note for folks that are hearing from the oil and gas industry about the inflated numbers, oftentimes they count convenience workers, gas station workers, retail workers. Again, that is a very good question to ask if you are presented with numbers that seem high. So these are the real figures. And again, yes, they're significant. But if we plan now, we can account and plan for how to transition over time these jobs, particularly in Kern County. So one thing we do have in our favor in terms of how do we manage the needs of the workforce is this is a trajectory over time. And so if you look at the first column, these are our young workers. These are the workers that are just coming up into the workforce. And you can see just in the past decade or less than a decade, the number of young people entering the oil and gas industry is declining. And now we're only seeing 0.3% of young people entering this job force. And then you look at the third and fourth graph, so the over 35 and over 55, you can see again, the share of people in these age groups are increasing over time. So we have the sense that portion of this workforce, a large portion of the oil and gas workforce will be aging out of the oil and gas industry. So it really is the 22 to 34-year-olds, people in mid-career that we need to focus on as we plan for a just transition. And so this brings us to the opportunities. Oil and gas, with all of its different health problems, with all of its variability, kind of this boom and bust cycle, which has really cost Kern County quite a lot, not only in terms of the environmental costs, but the economic costs. So we have to look at what makes Kern County unique, what other industries make sense. So one I started talking about, but it's this idea of all of these orphan wells, these wells that continue to pose an environmental risk, that are singularly well suited for oil and gas workers, because it's oil and gas work, it's cleaning up, it's making sure that the wells that were used in our past are clean, and that our communities, you know, are safer. So here are some of the astronomical figures in terms of the number of likely orphan wells that we'll see in California's future and that will need to be cleaned up. You'll also see that there's quite a discrepancy in terms of how much money is available and how much actually will be needed in order to fully clean up the cost. So this is maybe a policy question for another day, but did want to highlight in terms of policy solutions. This one is a key one, both in terms of, you know, raising the amount of money that we need, but also in terms of opportunities for job transition and job conversion. The other one I will just mention is, in addition to the remediation needed for oil wells, there are also contaminated sites from other industrial practices in California all throughout the state, including in the Central Valley. And so here again, you know, there's estimates that there are about 200,000 contaminated sites just dotting the landscape in California, waiting for a characterization, waiting to be investigated, waiting to be cleaned up and beneficially reused if possible. So again, this is another big area that we should be looking at in terms of opportunities for job conversion. I do want to mention that CRPE is involved in the High Road Training Partnership workforce program. We were awarded for 2021, the High Road Regional Workforce Strategies. There's 2 awarded in the state. One is for Kern County, the other is in Contra Costa. And we'll be diving in deeply in terms of looking at what opportunities exist for Kern County. What are the unique characteristics? What are the industries and sectors that excite the local workforce as well as residents? Our project is really meant to work directly with the stakeholders, work directly with workers, work directly with residents to lead the conversations about how we want Kern County to look like in the next 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. So it's a very aspirational, high-level look at transforming the economy and making sure that we have good employment opportunities for people living in Kern. So if you're interested in the project, please reach out to me. I'll leave my contact information at the end. So what are the key takeaways? One, the decline is inevitable of oil and gas, and we cannot continue to rely on it, neither in California nor in Kern County. So our choice before us right now is whether the decline will be managed or unmanaged. Right now, we're dealing with an unmanaged decline. And again, that variability, the boom and bust cycles are greatly impactful to both fossil fuel workers and their families, and also to social services and other in the budget in Kern County. So to the extent that we have time right now to plan out how we're going to deal with this decline, it will help both the residents and workers in Kern County as well as the state. Secondly, the job figures, again, they're not insignificant. You know, we need to take a close look at how do we protect fossil fuel workers. But again, they're not insurmountable. And the composition and the demographics are in our favor. So again, let's not shy away from this difficult problem, but let's dive into it. And finally, I just pointed out oil well and toxic site remediations are promising avenues for job growth. They are but 2. There are many others. Kern County is a very unique place, and I am really looking forward to working with stakeholders in Kern County to dive in and figure out what makes sense for the region. I feel very confident that we can find those paths forward. So with that, here's my contact if you'd like to reach out, and I will pass it back to you, Katie. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid, very much appreciated. Now next, we will go on to speak about oil worker impacts and workforce development opportunities. So to speak to that is Ruben Rodriguez with the Latino Equity Advocacy and Policy Institute, or LEAP Institute. Go ahead, Ruben.
Good morning, everyone. Mucho gusto. Thank you guys for having me here. First of all, I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge that I stand on the land of the indigenous Yaqut Nation. I would also like to thank VISIÓN and CVAQ for the opportunity and thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Ruben Rodriguez. I am an air quality analyst with the LEAP Institute and have lived in the Central Valley for over 25 years. And today I would like to talk to you about my personal experience within the oil and gas industry. I would like to start off today by providing you guys a little bit of background. So I live in the city of Coringa, located on the west side of Fresno County. I recall as a young child traveling out of town and coming across pumping units disguised as an elephant, a rhino, a zebra, to name a few. So these were pumping units that formed the so-called Iron Zoo out here in Coringa. As you lowered into the neighboring canyon, the first thing that you would notice was the colorful pumping units, followed by a terrible whiff of rotten eggs added to the mix. Right, and at a peak, this Iron Zoo featured over 50 oil pumps. Right, so as a child, I didn't understand the bigger picture. Right, all I saw was the art, and that was what I understood. Right, so oil was rediscovered in Coringa in the late 19th century, where to date the extraction of oil in the Pleasant Valley has been happening for over 100 years. In fact, it is the 8th largest oil field in California, being the largest in Fresno County. In September of 1909, near Coringa, the Silvertip 1 well struck oil and flowed out of control at 10,000 to 20,000 barrels per day for about a week before sand plugged the well. During this time, neighboring wells were producing anywhere from 10 to 2,000 barrels a day. So at this time, this was known as the greatest gusher in California, causing so much excitement that the LA stock market exchange closed so that its members could come down to Coringa on what was called then a special excursion, right? Not mentioned as much, right? And sadly, during the time of this rediscovery, the Tachi tribe, which is part of the Yokut Nation, were living in Coringa. They had been relocated to this area, but were forced out to the Santa Rosa Rancheria near Lemoore upon the rediscovery of oil. The natives knew that this resource was here, so I say rediscovered because they were already utilizing it in the building of their tools, the basket weaving, and even trade, right? And it's important to me to make sure that is clear, right? It's rediscovered because this is something that we have seen throughout history, right? So the so-called discovery or discovery of the gold, right? And even the discovery of America, okay? So working within the industry. So upon returning from Sacramento, where I was helping a campaign out there, it was a 15 and a union campaign. This was about November of 2014, I believe. A friend of mine had mentioned an opportunity to work out in the oil field or the oil patch as mentioned by these workers. So I was in a tough situation, took the opportunity, took the job, and it gave me a chance to see, firsthand that the individuals and companies that were out there were cutting corners and completely disregarding the seriousness of the work. Things such as gas leaks, oil leaks, and the spraying of contaminated well water on back roads. In fact, the most concerning thing that went down when I was out there was that when we were let go or ran off the lease, just due to safety concerns, there was about 15,000 feet of pipe that we had already laid out in the hills. And I came to find out that after having these wells inspected, the majority of them did not pass inspection. So there was 15,000 feet of pipe out there that was scrapped, right? And the new contractors that came in had to start the project again. And it's very concerning, right? Very, very concerning. That's a lot of pipe out there. Putting at risk, right, the health of the workers, the people, and the planet, right? And such negligence only points to the culture of a failed industry. So at first I was nervous, I was nervous to talk about this. I was nervous to bring this up, thinking, am I going to get in trouble for what I say? Will there be any repercussions for me speaking up and speaking out against the industry, right? But then I remember what I'm doing and who I'm doing it for, and for those that do not hold a seat at this table, right? Those do not have a voice. So although there is sufficient evidence that can prove that this industry is having negative effects on our health and the environment, there are individuals in the positions of authority that seem to not understand or simply not care. I'm upset that we continue to have this debate, upset that there is evidence out there that proves, to this truth, yet the system is centered around gains and does not seem to understand the seriousness of the matter. Profit over people and the health of our environment is what we are witnessing. In fact, there was a sister that wrote a book called Exxon and the Road Not Taken, right? That uncovered that Exxon had been at the cutting edge of science and understood that climate change was real. And instead of challenging the status quo, they were complicit, in the destruction of our climate. This in itself is something that's mind-blowing, right? The industry knew about this all along, yet here we are, right? Here we find ourselves. So me, myself, I have witnessed the firsthand gradual changes that have taken place in my community. I recall first arriving in Colinga, and the creek that was neighboring our community there had flowing water for weeks and at times even months after the rain was gone. In fact, my mother telling me stories of how all the creeks that ran within the Pleasant Valley had running water all year round. As a young child, I also remember walking around the cotton fields around that creek and running across beautiful red foxes that I no longer see anywhere near Colinga. And although this was my experience growing up, I was too young to connect the dots at the time. I did not understand that what I was witnessing was directly intertwined with the very same industry that my community praised, right? In fact, during my testimony in favor of AB 345, I was personally attacked by a prominent member of Senate for simply speaking out on factual concerns. As mentioned earlier, the science exists, right? There's sufficient evidence that can prove that this is real science and not fake news, right? So hearing the individual take the approach that he did was scary, quite frankly, it was scary, right? And it shows me that in the abundance of water, only the fool is thirsty, right? And I say this because the technology exists, right? There is enough out there that you can pull from, right? To prove to you that this is real, right? So I had the blessing of being raised by a mother that understood the relationship that we have with the earth, I remember at an early age walking and picking up a branch as we were heading out of the neighborhood and swatting, right, or hitting a few plants that crossed my path or that I crossed their path as I was walking. And my mother simply saying, hey, mijo, las plantas también sienten, right? So saying, hey, the plants also have feelings, right? And I was blessed to be given that understanding at such an early age, right? Because right now, most of the adults do not even make that connection. They no longer understand that, right? So the way that I was connected with LEAP was during a school board meeting that me and one of my brothers had attended. We walked out a little bit early just due to some of the things that were happening there, and I ran across my boss, right, the director. Had a brief conversation with them, and less than a month, I went from working in the oil fields as a roustabout to an air quality technician for the LEAP Institute, right? So the LEAP Institute stands for the Latino Equity Advocacy and Advocacy Policy Institute that has been working with Valley communities to help achieve economic, environmental, and climate justice. LEAP has helped develop leadership of various communities, not only in the Central Valley, but throughout the state of California, helping bring together government, residents, and other agencies to help advance the development of these communities. One of the current programs that we have is our Green Carreteros Rural Ride Share program that offers families transportation to important destinations, such as doctor visits and social service appointments, utilizing electric vehicles that minimize our carbon footprint, while also providing jobs and essential services to these communities. The LEAP's new motto is Leading Innovation for Equity, Life. We are working also on the High Road Training Program, helping train and reskill farm workers, the unemployed, and locals on micro manufacturing and maintenance of clean renewable technologies. With over 20 years of advocacy and organizing in the Valley, our executive director has been at the forefront of the movement to improve the quality of life with the emphasis on clean air, clean energy, and economic justice. So here at the LEAP Institute, we are all about a just transition. So thank you guys for the time, and I'll go ahead and pass it back to Katie.
Thank you, Ruben. Really appreciate you being here today and sharing your experiences. So now to talk about what a just transition for workers could look like, we have Tracey Brieger with Jobs for Justice. Go ahead, Tracey.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. For those of you who don't know Jobs with Justice San Francisco, I'll just say a little bit about it. It's a coalition of 30 organizations, half labor unions and half community groups, working together to strengthen workers' voices and rights and push for racial and economic justice. So thank you so much for inviting me to participate. This is such a critical discussion. And I'm really excited to share a number of critical perspectives side by side. So complementing what many have said before, thank you, Ruben and Ingrid, for setting up a lot of questions about workers in the workforce. I want to talk about just transition a bit more generally. And so first start by taking a bit of a step back. So 3 points I want to make today. The first is that we really need to take a broad look at just transition in workers. The second sort of big question on the table is how are we actually going to take care of fossil fuel workers in the transition? And the third is just some quick tips on working with labor around just transition. So to the first point of needing to look more broadly when we talk about labor and just transition. So I want to put just transition in its proper context. Addressing climate change requires a massive reorganization of our energy system and economy. So the writing is on the wall from California policy and beyond that the fossil fuel industry will necessarily decline, and the workers in it will undergo shifts. We also know that clean energy sectors will expand significantly and create many jobs. So those are both central trends, but they're also not the whole picture of a just transition. The work that we need to do to reorganize the energy system and the economy encompasses many sectors. For example, we need a robust and well-funded public sector to manage this infrastructure build-out. This will create significant number of public sector jobs, from engineers to administrators. We need to expand healthcare and the caring economy sectors, because as we know, climate change is creating ongoing and escalating health risks for all community members. This will create many more jobs in healthcare. And another example, and there are many, many more like this, but what if we thought about things a little bit differently? We need to ensure that energy efficient buildings are properly maintained. Why don't we train our janitors as skilled and certified green building inspectors? Honestly, after the engineers, the janitors are the folks who know the buildings the best. So just to remind us that when we actually talk about jobs and the green economy and just transition, we're talking about a massive range of jobs. So as we know, climate change, and others have said this, is already forcing reorganization of our economy. And here's the thing. So transition is inevitable, but justice is not. So we must ensure that the jobs that we create are high road, good union jobs with strong labor standards that protect the safety of both workers and community. And we need to ensure that these jobs are accessible to frontline and BIPOC community members and all people who've been systematically excluded from the benefits of our current system. A true just transition to a new green economy enables us to dismantle the US's gaping wealth and racial inequalities. So we can do this in part by having labor unions, necessarily including the unions that represent, for example, the public sector and healthcare workers, among many others, involved in the development of just transition policies. As you've all heard from environmental justice advocates and environmental justice community members, community members need to be involved in the decisions that affect them. And we need to realize that's the same for workers too, right? Workers need to be involved in these decisions. And again, thinking about that broad range of workers. So we must be inclusive when we think about workers involved in just transition. And we need to talk about the totality of job creation at the same time as we keep a laser focus to ensure that these are good union jobs with family sustaining wages. So that's just a call at first to really think broadly. When we say just transition, it's a massive undertaking, and the work and workers involved likewise come from many, many different sectors. Though of course, part of just transition, fossil fuel workers are at the center, and we need to pay special attention to sectors that will shrink, and we need to take care of these workers. Many of you probably saw the news this week from coal miners and the Coal Miners Union in West Virginia. The United Mine Workers of America said that they would support transition away from fossil fuels in exchange for job retraining, wage replacement, and preferential hiring for out-of-work coal miners. So that's huge. These are absolutely fossil fuel workers who've said, like, look, we see what's happening, and we know that we need to move towards thinking about the future and thinking about what it's actually going to take care of our workers when the transition happens. As I said, transition is inevitable, justice is not. So those policies that the mine workers talked about are exactly the kinds of policies we need to consider for all fossil fuel workers. And we need to be serious about funding them, right? Workers won't trust just transition language if it doesn't include funding. This is gonna take a little bit of money. So in California, the policies that we need to look at, this is just a list. It includes these things. It's not necessarily a thorough list, but a glide path to retirement, right? For those workers that are getting close to retirement, how do we look at full wage replacement, health benefits, and pension contributions for every worker closer to retirement? For workers that are transitioning, we need income guarantees at their current income levels for them for at least several years into their new jobs. We need to fully take care of retraining costs, including tuition and other related costs as folks are retraining. And we need to make sure that we are supporting them while we're doing that, right? This comes back to the income guarantees. This is also a massive undertaking. We need peer counseling services during transition. This is no small thing. It can be scary to shift to a new sector at any point in one's life. And so we really need to take that seriously and support workers. We need to look at employment placement services, prioritizing the clean energy sector while preserving the seniority of workers who are shifting into new sectors. And for those who might want to move, of course, not everyone does, but of course we would need to support relocation for those who choose to move. So noting that within all of this, and thanks Ingrid for mentioning this, oil well remediation is important work, and it needs to be just one small option in a grand field, grand set of options available for oil field workers in transition and for refinery workers in transition. So third quick point, just this is especially for the Senate staff on the call. So some tips on talking and working with labor on these topics. So labor solidarity is very real, and labor is not a monolith. Both of these things are true. And like any other community, there are some dynamic tensions within labor. And as I mentioned before, there are many diverse unions who will be impacted by just transition, and so many that are open to having discussions about just transition. And we need to make sure that the workers from these unions, that their voices are heard too. So this is just an open invitation. Feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk with you if you're trying to navigate some of these questions about how to talk with labor and how to talk about workers when it involves a just transition. I can put my info in the chat, but that's I think I'll leave it there. Just looking at a call for just transition broadly, some very specific and funded policies to take care of fossil fuel workers. And knowing that labor is not a monolith and that there are opportunities to talk to many different voices and workers within the labor movement about just transition. And with that, I think I'll pass it back to Katie. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Really appreciate you joining us today. So now we'll start with our questions and answers. So a reminder that's been posted in the chat, if you have questions for anybody on the call, please submit them using the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. But first, we'll start with the question that was submitted before the webinar, and we'll start with Ingrid, I think, on this one, and then others can chime in before we get to the rest of the questions. How will these just transition jobs replace the government revenue that oil production helps sustain by providing property taxes that fund government services in counties like Kern? So Ingrid, you want to start with that?
Yes, and I think it's a critical question because when you're dealing with the transition away from the fossil fuel industry, you're dealing with jobs. But for Kern County, you're also dealing with significant and sizable tax base for the county. I kind of want to change the premise of the question because yes, fossil fuel industry in boom years contributes quite a lot to the Kern County tax base, and that shouldn't be underestimated. However, because Kern County is so reliant on that tax base for social services, and other county needs, when you have these bust years, which happen quite frequently, when your oil gas prices drop, which you can't account for, you can't plan for, you can't plan around, then Kern County social services and the support structures there collapse. And we saw it happen in 2014 through 2016. We saw it happen in 2020. And so it really decimates the local economy. And so I actually think this tax base question is yet another reason why transitioning the economy is so important. And also that as we plan for what we want to move into, what are those sectors that make sense for Kern County, we have to look at the tax base as part of the equation. It is true, and I think this has been mentioned, and so it is true that solar is exempt from a lot of taxes. And so, and I don't think anyone on this call in this panel has ever said, the solution to all of these issues is only solar. I think you've heard very clearly that there is not a silver bullet, that we need to be looking at multiple sectors, in order to find those conversion sectors. And so part of that calculation needs to be this tax base. And so that is going to be, I think, really critical to the planning that we're going to be doing for the next couple of years in Kern County. But what we do know is that Kern County's reliance on the oil and gas and the fossil fuel industry is ultimately harmful, not only because of the workforce issues, but because of the tax base issues as well.
Thank you, Ingrid. Does anybody else on the panel want to chime in on this question?
This is Catherine with CVAQ. I would just briefly add that in a lot of the analysis that we see around environmental regulations, there's rarely, if ever, any kind of accounting for the impact to people's health. And effectively, we are subsidizing the oil industry with our lungs, our bodies, and our health. And I think that's often left out of the equation, and those are critical impacts that we also should not be underestimating.
Absolutely. I think there was a study came out that put that to the billions of dollars that we were paying in terms of health outcomes and lost work and lost school and the like. Another question that was just submitted is, does anybody have an estimate of the magnitude of funding required to fully fund a just transition? Or any idea as to how we would pay for this? Is this federal government funding or the like? So I don't know if anybody wants to try to chime in on that question. No pressure. I would say, just to get us rolling, that I think a lot of that depends on what the transition is, and that needs to be something that's defined by workers, which is to Tracey's point about making sure that this is a diversity of options that meet their needs. That would really decide how. But I also sit and lucky to serve as a local government official in Sacramento, and we talk about this money coming down from the federal government for economic recovery, and what an opportunity that is coming out of COVID to really jumpstart some of these economic engines that could provide really great jobs that aren't reliant on polluting industries. So I saw Tracey briefly come off mute. Sorry if I jumped in there.
No, that's a great point. Thanks, Katie. Robert, I guess I would just say, please stand by. We are working to do that research right now. And so hopefully in the next several months, we will actually have a report that really details that, because it's important, right? Like how much money, like how many jobs are we talking about? Like, what is the funding that we'll need to properly take care of workers? And what are the investments we need to make? And how many jobs are those going to create too? So it's a both and. So it's a great question. We've had it too. And I hope that we will have a very concrete answer for you with numbers in the next several months.
Thank you, Tracey, for that work. And again, a reminder, I see some folks trying to raise their hand. If you could submit your questions in the Q&A box, that would be much appreciated. The next, we actually got a couple of questions, one from Soledad and one from another attendee that look like they're from local residents, right, who are concerned about industry expansion in their community, concerned about local electeds who seem to be more aligned with the industry than with what they might want for their communities. So are looking for advice. How do they get involved? How do they push back? So I don't know, Juan, if you'd like to start us off, Juan from Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, who lives and organizes in Kern County, on some ways that folks could get involved at the local level.
Definitely. So to answer the question of Orvin, yeah, I believe the mayor of Taft did a presentation on the council meeting of the city of Orvin, and it is right. It was full of lies. And how do we counterattack? There's a local group in Orvin, Committee for a Better Orvin. I'll suggest that you get in contact with them. They have their office on Burr Mountain Boulevard, right next to Express Tax. It says CVAQ. You're more than welcome to give them a call. They have their phone number there. I'm also gonna drop my email. If you wanna email me, I can give you their direct phone number as well. And we gotta belong to these local groups, right? We gotta make sure we engage, we participate, because we have to hold our elected officials accountable. We have to call them out and say, you know what, that's a lie. If anybody does anybody recall what happened in Orvin after the incident that Francisco was talking about earlier? the mayor back then, Jose Gurrola, tried to put an emergency resolution to put a ban on or any sort of oil activity, and that was resisted. The community, they're organized. In the next election cycle, they voted out a lot of these council members, and they put in a very progressive young council that actually passed an ordinance that said setbacks within the community. So let's get active. Let's participate on these committees. The same goes for Soledad in chapter. There's a committee in chapter, Committee for a Better Chapter. They're doing tremendous work. They wrap up their SB 117 participation. They are now working on SB 1000. They're very active. Make sure that you find these groups and insert yourself into these groups, because they have been active for a decade now, a little bit over a decade, both of the groups. So they're very active, and they have done a lot of good on their communities. So let's be active. Let's take action. Let's call out our elected officials and hold them accountable. That would be my advice.
Thank you, Juan. And I wonder if Dan and Kobe want to talk briefly about the legislative efforts that are underway and how folks might plug into that work if they're interested.
Sure, I can answer this question. Hi, everyone. My name is Kobe. Again, I can share a little bit more, excuse me, a little bit more about SB 467, which was a Senate bill that originally was going to try and answer some of these questions about a managed decline away from fossil fuels in California and just transition. Without going into too much context, because there's a lot of other important questions, right now, SB 467 is focused on the fight for setbacks, which means a minimum distance from where you can drill for oil and gas in sensitive areas like our homes, schools, and healthcare sites. And what we learned this past week was that a lot of folks in Sacramento are unprepared to really get into the details and understand like what a just transition means. And it's up to us to continue bringing this conversation to the table to talk about what is best for our communities and the vision that we have for what our communities will look like, considering the decline of oil and gas markets in California and in the rest of the country and the world. So I encourage everyone, if you're interested in getting involved with this issue, which is statewide affecting all of California, please check out the information I'll be posting in the chat about how you can hold some of our elected officials accountable to making sure that they take action for a just transition, and the very beginning steps toward that, which is protecting people first, protecting the environmental justice frontline communities that are sheltering in place right now. Like we heard from folks in Nelson Court earlier on this call, every day breathing in the pollution from oil and gas sites in their neighborhoods. So if you want to learn more about holding folks accountable in the future of setbacks and just transition in California, I'll post my email and some other information on how you can take action and make phone calls in the chat in a second here.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to this question?
I did just want to add to the question of confronting the lies of industry. I think we all have a role to play in really checking those sources. I think Katie mentioned earlier, like asking for citations, where are you getting this information? Really being critical consumers, particularly for those in the media and in legislative offices. If you are hearing, whether it's local politicians or whoever it is who's presenting these job numbers, talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs, 50,000 jobs, and asking, where's this number coming from? Because there aren't 50,000 jobs in the entire sector. And so where are you getting this? And really being critical consumers and pushing on those actual statistics instead of just accepting them, just really ask detailed questions about it and force them to defend their credibility, which frankly is indefensible.
Thank you, Dan, appreciate that. So another question, and this might be our last question we have time for, about what about workers who are not in a union, and how do they plug into this conversation, and what does this look like? What does this look like for them? This is a common sort of talking point is, you know, actually there's union jobs in oil extraction, but actually a lot of oil extraction workers aren't all represented by a union. So what does this transition look like for them? I don't know, Tracey, if you want to start us off on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, you know, it's our belief that we should be taking care of all fossil fuel workers, whether or not they're in unions. And so really thinking about how to, like, in a transition, how do we take care of all the workers? You know, I just heard the other day of an interesting example of in airport workers, there's a list that the government maintains of seniority because the companies can come and go. And so in transition from folks who work at airports, how do they shift into other jobs and maintain their seniority? So that's, I think, a question that we need to look at for all fossil fuel workers too, whether or not they, like, whether they are or aren't in unions. So all of those things that I listed in terms of, you know, income guarantees, retraining, you know, support for retirement, like all of those things should be offered to non-union workers too. Absolutely. And who can folks talk to? I mean, this is a I wasn't quite sure with the question, like, well, which workers and about what? But I think in terms of, you know, if fossil fuel workers are interested in getting engaged in just transition and are really curious about these ideas, we can connect folks. I mean, it depends on which part of the state you're in. It's a big state, but happy to connect folks with other people in the labor movement who are working on these issues. So I had put my information in the chat. If you are, or if you know of fossil fuel workers who are interested in talking about this, please reach out.
And I will just add, you know, if folks, if workers are in Kern County and they would like to be connected up with the HRTP, High Road Training Partnership program, you can also reach out to me. Our other partners include Bakersfield College. So if they're more comfortable reaching out to Bakersfield College, or the UC Merced Community and Labor Center is the other partner there. So any of the three of our groups would be happy to bring folks into the fold as we talk about what the future looks like in Kern County.
And I think that really applies movement wide. And this is a good note to end on. You know, I think this narrative that those of us who are fighting for the environment and environmental justice don't care about the workers when the workers live in the same communities that we're fighting for is false. You know, we want to make sure that workers are taken care of. We're ready to stand and fight for solutions, and we want to engage with everybody involved in this so that we can find a pathway that really makes sense and is meaningful and works for the workers and for the communities that are impacted by these industries. So with that, it's 10:59. I want to thank our panelists and thank everybody who participated in this. It is being recorded, and so I imagine something will be available later, but just want to thank again you for joining us in this really important conversation that's happening right now, and again offer us all as people who are willing to keep engaging in this conversation and working towards solutions for workers and for communities. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.